Hey guys, tonight we're not traveling to a distant star or falling into a black hole. We're staying right here, in the same universe, but with one rule quietly rewritten. No alarms, no announcements, just a slight change in something fundamental, the speed of light. Imagine a flashlight that takes minutes to light the wall in front of you. Imagine the stars above you, not where they seem, but long gone. Tonight, we explore what happens when the one constant the cosmos depends on begins to drift. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy slow, thoughtful journeys like this one. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it feels like where you are. Time might not be real, but I still love reading about it. Now, dim the lights, maybe crack a window. Turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's drift slowly, together, into a universe where the lights are still on. They're just running late. There was no flash, no siren, no dramatic distortion of reality. The speed of light did not explode or vanish. It simply changed. A constant, no longer constant. Somewhere deep inside a lab orbiting Saturn, a sensor blinked slower than expected. Not broken, not faulty, just late. Dr. Jana Heller noticed the delay first. Her console, running 1 million quiet background checks per second, showed a mismatch in expected arrival times of photons from a nearby monitoring array. It was off by fractions of a second, then by more. Her colleague, Neeraj, laughed it off at first. Space weather, he said. Solar noise. But then the discrepancy spread. The light from Jupiter's moons, previously arriving with military precision, now lagged behind. Not much, but enough. Maybe it's the instruments, Neeraj offered. But they weren't malfunctioning. They were just faster than the universe now. On Earth, nothing changed, at first. Sunlight still poured through windows. Shadows still stretched across city streets. But on high-precision telescopes and time-calibrated arrays, the past began to stack. Astronomers started noticing double images, stars appearing in places they hadn't occupied in centuries. A delay, like watching a live broadcast, then realizing you're seeing a recording. The universe is buffering, one physicist joked, but no one laughed, because the shift kept growing. The speed of light, previously 299,792, 458 meters per second, was now slower by 2%, and slowing still. On Earth, this didn't mean lights flickered or their electronics failed. The internal mechanisms of perception are so immediate, so local, that humans didn't feel the change in their daily lives. But the stars did. The sky was no longer a map of now. It was a graveyard of then. The moon, once 1.28 light seconds away, now drifted in memory. Communications with Mars had a new kind of delay, not just in distance, but in distortion. Images took longer to arrive, but worse, they were wrong. Objects weren't where they appeared. Ships navigating deep space had to account not just for relativity, but for a fundamental mismatch in how time and distance express themselves. Light is language, Jana wrote in her report, and we're forgetting how to read it. Neeraj disagreed. No, light is memory, and we're watching it rot. Across observatories, confusion turned to concern. One team in Chile mapped a supernova remnant that should have been in a certain sector, only to find it blurred, bent, spread out across space like a fingerprint pressed into fabric. Another lab in Canada saw twin quasars blink out of sync. Cosmic microwave background data began to warp, not with noise, but with delay, not errors, just past. It wasn't just about speed anymore. It was about relevance. If light was no longer fast enough to keep up with change, Then reality itself became asynchronous. We're living in the present, one article declared, but seeing the past, and not the poetic stargazing kind of past, a dangerous past, one where you might see a comet in the sky, not knowing it had already impacted a moon 3 hours ago. One where the warning signs of gamma radiation arrive minutes after exposure. One where defense satellites can't track trajectories because the data is always historical. Every scan, every image, every frame of visual information became suspect. What you saw was not what is, but what was. And the more distant the object, the more fictional its appearance. Earth's atmosphere didn't shift. Its oceans didn't boil. But its relationship to truth unraveled. A society built on observation now faced the unthinkable. A world where vision lies. The space agencies tried to compensate. Predictive models were updated. Delay compensation protocols were deployed. But models are only as good as their assumptions. And the speed of light had never been a variable. This is epistemological erosion, a philosopher tweeted. We're not losing reality. We're losing timing. But the most terrifying part wasn't that the change was continuing. It was that no one knew why it began. There were no experiments, no reactors, no black hole collisions. The constants of physics, the things written in stone, had quietly been edited, and the edit came with no author. People began to ask, had this happened before? Was the speed of light always fixed? Or had it fluctuated before the invention of precision, before we knew enough to notice? Churches, forums, think tanks began to light up with speculation. Some claimed the universe was correcting itself. Others said it was preparing to end. But those working in the field, like Yana and Neeraj, had a simpler fear. We no longer know what now means, Neeraj whispered. And without now, everything becomes after. Ships sent into orbit had to rely on blind flight. Drones that once used visual sensors switched to physical ones. Submarines became more accurate than satellites. Underwater cable networks, once mocked for being outdated, became the most reliable form of information transmission. And through it all, the light continued to slow. Not linearly, not predictably, but with intent, as if the universe was asking us to stop looking outward, to slow down, to remember that we had built our understanding on something that was never truly ours, light. And now it was slipping away. The slowness wasn't felt, not in the skin or the bones or the pulse. It wasn't like gravity, which you could lean against, or heat, which burned immediate. This slowness was cognitive, abstract. It didn't press into the body, it pressed into meaning. On Earth, the average person still turned on a light switch and saw the room illuminate, still checked their phone, still watched the sunset. But satellites in orbit began sending updates marked as invalid, not because of errors, but because by the time the data reached its target, the situation it described no longer existed. A storm system seen by satellite was gone by the time emergency services were alerted. A solar flare noticed by instruments took too long to be confirmed. The flare had already struck. Reality has a delay, Yana wrote in her internal log. We're living in playback mode. Neeraj proposed new compensatory timing systems, quantum-based entanglement relays, backup particle streams, and tight-loop dark mode scanning. But it wasn't enough, because the core problem wasn't technical. It was philosophical. If light is the only thing that lets us see the universe, and light is now late, then we are surrounded not by stars, but by ghosts. Ghosts that still shine, but shine wrongly. This is observational drift, he explained to a briefing panel. It means our instruments are ahead of what they're measuring. They are too fast for the truth. In the public sphere, people didn't panic. Not in the Hollywood disaster sense. But something else happened. Something subtler. They started turning off their telescopes, their live streams, their Earth cams and orbit cams and views from space. Because it didn't feel like looking anymore. It felt like spying on a corpse. We used to look at the stars for guidance, said a radio host on a midnight show. Now they just remind us how wrong we always were. One religion declared that this was divine silence, that the heavens no longer wished to be witnessed. Another claimed that time itself had been infected. But the scientific world, always slow to poetry, began describing the phenomenon in terms of entropy and delay vectors. It didn't help, because underneath all the models and spreadsheets was a single unbearable truth. We don't know what's happening right now, anywhere, not even to each other. Long-distance video calls began to desync, not because of the internet, but because the cameras relied on optical feedback. Military satellites, which operated on real-time imaging, had to be grounded. Drones could no longer be trusted to respond to what they saw. Even navigation systems on Earth began failing, not because the satellites were gone, but because their light could no longer arrive fast enough to be useful. The universe is still there, Jana said to herself. But the visible universe is a lie. On the moon, an independent mining station called Hesperia Base lost visual contact with Earth, not from obstruction, but from irrelevance. They still received signals, still saw the planet, but what they saw was always hours old. They tried to call home. The signal arrived, but the answer came too late. A loop formed, a delay, like watching a conversation unfold underwater. It's not isolation, one miner said. It's dislocation. A kind of cognitive vertigo set in. People began reporting feelings of being out of phase, of being present and not, of touching things but not trusting what they saw. Psychologists called it photonic derealization, a new kind of disassociation, caused not by trauma or stress but by lag. Museums removed telescopes from public programs. Planetariums began running simulations instead of live star maps. And slowly, the idea of space became fiction again. Not because we stopped believing, but because we could no longer participate. The stars became archives, the cosmos, a memory. And in all of it, one question kept returning. What caused it? No particle collision, no alien device, no dimensional rift. It had just started, quietly. One day light was fast enough, the next it wasn't. Maybe we crossed a threshold, Niraj suggested, like redlining a cosmic engine. Or maybe, Jana countered, the speed of light was never fixed, just agreed upon. The implications were vast. If light speed was conditional, then so was time, so was distance, so was cause and effect. What we see might no longer be a result, Jana said. It could be a leftover. And in that silence, somewhere in the void, light continued to move, still fast by human terms, still impossible by earthly standards, but no longer fast enough. A relic of speed, a remnant of presence. And we, still watching, were now further behind than we had ever been. In the early days of the shift, vision was still trusted. The assumption that seeing was believing held firm. But as the lag widened, people began to notice something stranger than darkness, clarity without context. Images of cities from orbital cameras showed traffic patterns that no longer existed. Fires that had already been extinguished. Ships still docked that had since departed. The world was visible, but only as it once had been. We are watching ourselves with nostalgia, a journalist wrote. And it was true. In classrooms, students were shown live views of Earth that were already obsolete. News reports displayed space-based footage hours behind, overlaid with digital corrections that blurred the difference between now and then. "We're editing time," Jana said in a private research entry. Not understanding it. Predictive algorithms surged in popularity, not just in government systems, but in personal life. People began relying on AI-generated present states, guesses stitched together from historical data, satellite memory, and behavioral modeling. This is probably what the city looks like now, apps would say, offering real-time approximations of landscapes, weather, even sky color. But no one knew for sure. On Mars, the colonists implemented what they called the Ghost Protocol, a system of duplicated instrumentation where every vital sensor had both optical and inertial backup. "We can't trust the light," the mission commander said. "Only the touch." They turned to mechanical sensing, physical contact, pressure, vibration, heat. In short, they trusted what couldn't lie. But even that came with delay, because even mechanical systems depended on interpretation. And interpretation ultimately relied on signals, and signals were light. On Earth, old technologies found new relevance. Seismographs, barometers, and analog instruments returned to prominence. People in rural areas began using shadow clocks and pendulums, not because they worked better, but because they were honest about their limitations. "I'd rather be wrong and know I'm wrong," said one farmer, "than be told something's right when it isn't." Philosophers revived ancient debates. Was time something we moved through, or something that moved through us? If we could no longer measure the present, did the present still exist? A movement began, small at first, of people refusing to look up. They called themselves the Dark Watch, not in fear, but in protest. "If light is late," their manifesto said, "then we refuse to be governed by its lies." They covered windows, avoided screens, carried notebooks instead of phones. "We don't need to see the stars to know we are real," one member said. Jana watched this unfold with fascination and dread. "They're not wrong," she said to Neeraj, "but they're not helping either." The scientific community splintered. Some doubled down on corrections, pushing for even more aggressive prediction models, feedback loops, quantum sensing arrays. Others called for observation moratoriums. "Every telescope pointed at the sky is now a historian," one astrophysicist declared, not a scientist. Meanwhile, the universe continued to send its signals. Slow, late, warped. Supernovae that occurred centuries ago reached visibility only now. Black holes seemed to vanish, not because they had moved, but because their light had never escaped. Space became more narrative than geometric, not a location, but a story. And like all stories, it depended on perspective. "We've made the cosmos into literature," Neeraj joked. "We see chapters, not chapters happening." In orbit, satellites began to be repurposed. Instead of scanning outward, they began scanning Earth, watching for consistency, for rhythm, for anything untainted by stellar lag. "Look in," Jana whispered. "We've spent centuries looking out, but maybe the answers are behind us." A project launched, the Inner Array, composed of synchronized modules designed to watch Earth from the inside out, rather than the outside in, not through images, but through motion, mass displacement, energy signatures, breathing patterns of cities. The hope was simple. Even if light failed, motion would not. But even motion, they realized, was only visible through reflected light. They were chasing ghosts with shadows. "Maybe we've always been doing that," Neeraj said. And maybe they had. In the absence of trustworthy observation, memory became sacred. People turned inward. Diaries became more valuable than news. Conversations replaced broadcasts. A person's lived experience, however biased, became the only reliable record. What did you see? Became a more meaningful question than, what happened? Because at least the answer came from a now. And in this strange inversion, Earth began to feel smaller, not because the universe had collapsed, but because certainty had. If you could not be sure of what the sky was doing, you focused on what the ground was, on the path in front of you, the breath in your lungs, the pulse under your fingers, not as denial, but as rebellion. The world is slowing, one writer said, so we will wait. Wait for the light, wait for clarity, wait to know what we are, not through vision, but through being. In the months that followed, the world began to diverge, not geographically, but temporally. A kind of temporal provincialism emerged. People began living in different nows depending on what information they trusted. Communities created their own internal clocks, no longer synchronized by global data feeds or satellite signals. What had once been unified by a single shared present, news broadcasts, global events, universal timestamps, now fractured into pockets of perception. We no longer share time, Yana said during a conference call, her voice reaching participants minutes late, and her image arriving in flickering fragments. We simulate it, locally, artificially. Even language began to change. Words like currently, now, and as we speak were quietly removed from newsrooms and scientific journals. Instead, writers used phrases like most recently confirmed or as last recorded. Entire social networks adapted. Time-delayed social feeds became the norm, with users encouraged to post reflectively, not reactively. Influencers began broadcasting time-agnostic content, images and messages that avoided referencing any present moment. The most popular new platform was called Echo, which allowed users to leave messages that would only be visible after a delay chosen by the sender. Truth grows clearer with time, its tagline said. The irony was not lost on anyone. Governments scrambled to manage this new reality. Weather forecasts were replaced with probability zones. Air traffic control switched to infrared and sonar-assisted protocols. Global stock markets, which relied on millisecond precision, began failing. Not because of economic collapse, but because causality could no longer be confirmed in real time. We're trading ghosts, said a financial analyst, on a collapsed investment stream. Reflections of events that may already be undone. Even crime changed. Surveillance footage became legally questionable. Witness testimonies, once considered unreliable, were now treated as privileged data. Human memory might be flawed, said one judge, but at least it isn't late. In hospitals, diagnostic scans were no longer enough. Doctors had to feel, listen, palpate. Nurses trained to detect subtleties of skin tone, breath rhythm, eye movement. All the things machines once measured better, but now too slowly to matter. In some regions, midwives and herbalists returned to prominence, not for mysticism, but for immediacy. At least she's here, one pregnant woman said of her village healer. She sees me now. And through it all, light continued to arrive, slower, more fragmented, refracted not just through space but through meaning. Scientists who once mapped galaxies began archiving, cataloguing not coordinates, but stories. What did the Andromeda Galaxy look like in the final days of fast light? One database asked. What did Saturn's rings show us before lag? Telescopes weren't shut down. They became museums, instruments of history, not tools of discovery. The past glows, read a plaque at the entrance of the Celestial Archive, a massive dome built in Greenland where ancient starlight was collected, annotated and displayed like fossils. Neeraj submitted a proposal to launch the Stillness Array, a new kind of telescope that wouldn't look outward at all. It would look inward, at light trapped inside Earth's atmosphere, bouncing, refracting, echoing. If we can't catch up to light, he argued, maybe we can hold on to what's already here. His idea was accepted, then delayed, then quietly absorbed into a classified research wing. Jana didn't ask why. She already suspected. Somewhere behind closed doors, someone was trying to simulate a now, a real one, a self-contained present, perhaps in a bunker, perhaps in orbit, a world cut off from lag, from the universe. That's not a solution, she muttered. That's a sarcophagus. But maybe that was the future. A museum of now, preserved in vacuum. Outside of it, society continued its slow shift. Art changed. Painters turned to pigment and canvas. Writers published physical books. Music was performed live, unrecorded, not for purity or nostalgia, but because the present could no longer be captured, only lived. A new philosophical school emerged called the immediate. They taught mindfulness, yes, but also refusal to interpret, to assume, to conclude. Do not say what is, their text read. Say only what seems. And what seemed more and more was this. Humanity had not lost the stars. It had lost the ability to synchronize with them. The sky remained full. The galaxies still spun, but they no longer invited participation. They were like letters from an old friend, postmarked long ago, arriving years late. Beautiful, meaningful, but never now. We're all astronauts now, Neeraj said in an interview. Floating in separate capsules of perception, watching each other through delayed transmissions. Still here, still human. Just staggered. And in that staggering, something else emerged. A strange kind of peace, a slower rhythm, a gentler breath. If the present was uncertain, then so was urgency. If you couldn't know what happened 10 seconds ago, perhaps it was enough to simply exist. One moment, one heartbeat, one unrecorded truth at a time. In a modest apartment on the edge of Reykjavik, a woman named Loa stopped opening her curtains. It wasn't because she feared what she'd see, but because she knew what she'd see would no longer be real. The northern lights still shimmered, but their dance was hours old. The stars still blinked, but their blinks belonged to last week. Even the moon, so close, so comforting, was no longer there when it appeared to be. Loa kept a notebook filled with delayed sightings. She would write down what she saw, and weeks later compare it to public data. It became a ritual, a way of marking time. I see what was, she scribbled in green ink, but I feel what is. In her silence, she joined millions. People around the world began replacing their clocks with candle timers, not because they were more accurate, but because they burned with them. A 1-hour candle did not simulate an hour. It was one, tangible, uncomplicated. The flame did not arrive late. It simply was. Schools began teaching history and astronomy in the same class. The difference between a galaxy and an empire, one teacher joked, is just how old the light is. Students no longer memorize distances in kilometers, but in hours of light lag. How long ago is the sun? A child might ask. 8 minutes, came the reply, but only if it's still there. There was no apocalyptic tone, no mass panic, only drift, like standing on a slowly separating ice shelf, not falling, just realizing the shore is no longer reachable. Governments quietly decommissioned long-range telescopes and diverted funding into local sustainability projects. "We cannot rely on stars that lie," said one official. "We must learn to look down." And people did. The soil became sacred. Cities planted gardens on rooftops, in hallways, along abandoned rail lines. In a world where light betrayed, the earth remained loyal. In Tokyo, a movement called grounding began. Participants would lie flat on the ground, eyes closed, and breathe with the soil. "The planet is slow," their manifesto read, "and so must we be." Jana watched this unfold with a mix of wonder and dread. "We're becoming pre-Copernican again," she said to Neeraj during one of their heavily delayed calls. "Not because we disbelieve science, but because the stars no longer give us science we can use." Neeraj disagreed. "It's not a step backward. It's an evolutionary pivot. We're adapting to unreliable inputs." But Jana couldn't shake the feeling that something was being lost. Not just observational clarity, but ambition. "We used to reach for the stars," she whispered. "Now we avoid their gaze." Museums removed live sky labels from their planetarium domes. The term was now considered misleading. Instead, they embraced a more poetic framing: the echoed sky. Visitors watched shows composed of old starlight simulations layered with musical interpretation and spoken word. The audience understood they were not watching truth, but memory. And it was enough. On deep space vessels, those caught far beyond Earth when the slowdown began, time became a cage. Pilots and researchers aboard long-range ships began experiencing a condition called temporal dissonance, a psychological state where the mind struggled to reconcile its actions with delayed visual feedback. "I see myself move," wrote one captain, "but only after I already have. I'm watching my own ghost." Engineers responded by reconfiguring cockpit windows. Some were removed entirely. Others were overlaid with predictive overlays. Not true images, but AI-generated interpretations of what should be there. One ship painted its interior windows black and inscribed the phrase, "If light is slow, then let darkness be honest." In time, this too became normal. Children born aboard these vessels would grow up never trusting visual input. Their reality was defined by feel, by sound, by proximity. "Sight is old," one child told a visiting psychologist. "I use now eyes." And what were now eyes? The child tapped her own chest. The part that knows before it sees. Back on Earth, timekeeping evolved. Not in accuracy, but in intimacy. Personal watches were replaced with pulse monitors. "My time is my heart," a slogan read. Time became bodily, private, felt. The global standard, once driven by atomic clocks and synchronized satellites, became largely ceremonial. It was still maintained, still calculated, but no longer trusted. Time, Jana noted, has been domesticated. It no longer ruled, it followed. And in that reversal, society slowed, not because of failure, but because rushing required certainty. Without it, there was no reason to hurry. And without hurry, there was finally time to sit still. Not because everything was fine, but because everything was unclear. And in that fog, a new kind of clarity emerged, not in sight, but in sense, in stillness, in surrender. Some began to argue that the slowdown of light was not a failure of the universe, but a failure of our expectations. "We built a civilization on the illusion of immediacy," said a philosopher in Berlin, "and now that illusion has cracked." At first his words were dismissed as poetic fatalism, but gradually they began to echo. In cities where once information pulsed from every screen, digital displays began to go dark, not from power loss, but from irrelevance. The stock tickers still updated, but no one believed them. Weather maps still showed motion, but it wasn't the sky above. Traffic cams became curiosities. Live cams of the ocean were replaced with looping footage labeled "Recent Best Estimate." "We're not observing anymore," said a data scientist. "We're storytelling." At major universities, the sciences were split. Some departments doubled down on quantum immediacy, entanglement, collapse, the desperate attempt to find any signal that could escape the slowness. Others pivoted toward the humanities. "If science is stuck," said a dean in Toronto, "then we must teach how to live in uncertainty." Students were encouraged to write fiction, to paint speculative realities, to compose music based on what they felt the stars were doing. It wasn't truth, but it was present. Meanwhile, the stars remained unchanged. They flickered, burned, exploded, all silently, all far behind. "We may never know if the sky is gone," Neeraj wrote in a public essay, "because by the time we see it disappear, we won't be here to witness it." The line became famous, not for its tragedy, but for its honesty. And in that honesty, people found stillness. Not peace exactly, but perspective. "If I cannot know what is happening," said one elderly woman in a documentary, "then I will love what I can touch." She sat in her garden. A cat curled beside her. The sun still shone, not now, not quite, but brightly enough to matter. Churches and temples began incorporating the delay into their rituals. Candles were lit with the acknowledgement that the flame seen by one person was not the flame seen by another. "We worship in delay," said a monk, "and perhaps we always have." Jana, still searching for the root of the shift, had turned inward. Not spiritually, but neurologically. She began studying how the human brain responds to delayed information, to outdated light. She discovered that certain individuals, often artists, musicians, or those raised in environments of trauma, had higher tolerance for discrepancy. "They can hold two truths at once," she wrote, "what is felt and what is seen." She began calling this duality perceptual elasticity, the ability to accept the present as both true and false depending on context. "Perhaps that's our evolution," Neeraj said during one of their late transmissions. "Not faster ships or bigger telescopes, but better minds." And yet, for all the adaptation, there were losses. One museum, once famous for its live view of the International Space Station, closed its observatory wing. The ISS was still visible, but no longer current. Its orbit, its crew, its mission, all historical by the time they were seen. The museum replaced the telescope with a mirror, a giant, perfectly polished disc that reflected only the room and those within it. "Here," the plaque read, "is the only thing that does not lie, your own delayless presence." Tourists visited in silence. Children stared at themselves. Old lovers stood hand in hand. A soldier removed his cap. In the quiet, the reflection spoke louder than any star. And elsewhere, on Earth, in orbit, in deep space, the question returned. What if the light is not slow? What if we are simply too fast? Too fast to wait, too fast to observe with care, too fast to admit that knowledge takes time. "We demanded a real-time truth," said a poet, and truth left the room. So what remained? Not the stars, not certainty, not speed, but memory and feeling, and the slow, honest process of becoming. "I don't know what's happening out there," Jana confessed in her journal, "but I know what's happening in here." She placed her hand on her chest. "And it's enough, for now, because perhaps that was the only real lesson, that the universe had not betrayed us. It had simply stopped pretending to keep up, and maybe, just maybe, that was its way of saying, slow down, watch less, be more. Somewhere in the Andes, high above the last whisper of city light, there was a telescope no longer connected to any network. Its system still functioned. The dome still rotated. The optics still adjusted each night with quiet, automatic precision. But no one watched its data. No one interpreted the streams. It became a machine that stared at the past for no one at all. Locals called it El Testigo, the witness. They left offerings on the mountain path. Small stones, scraps of paper, handwritten notes that simply said things like, "I see you, I remember," or "Thank you for looking, even when we stopped." Inside, the telescope's computers filled endless storage drives with unrequested images, star fields now mislabeled, galaxies that had since moved on, supernovae that exploded long before humanity built fire. The observatory had become a monument to delay, and it wasn't alone. All over Earth, former centers of vision turned inward. The Hawaii observatories dimmed their lenses. One of them was turned into a music hall. Its dome, once the eye of the world, now echoed with cello and voice. In the Arctic Circle, a deep-range solar monitor was transformed into a library of echo signals. Visitors were invited to listen to the slowed-down tones of solar storms, recorded months prior, now played back as music. "It's not what the sun is doing," the attendant said. "It's what it was." This shift from measurement to memorial became global. Old mission control centers became museums. Planetariums hosted retrospectives titled "The Last Real-Time Sky." Even classrooms began to change. Children were no longer taught to chart stars, but to write stories about what stars might choose to do next. Not predictions, fables. Because prediction assumed continuity, and continuity now belonged to faith. Jana, increasingly isolated in her work, began reaching out to historians, not of science, but of myth. She found common ground with a researcher in Turkey who specialized in ancient sky cults. They never believed the sky spoke truth, he told her over a delayed call, only that it reflected our hopes, our fears, our cycles. And now, Jana thought, perhaps we are returning to that, a time when the heavens were not a measurement tool, but a mirror. Neeraj disagreed. "The data is still valuable," he insisted. "It just needs new context. We're not losing science. We're losing timing." But even he had begun to modify his work. His lab no longer tracked active events. Instead, they archived stellar memory, old radiation patterns, the fingerprints of events that were long gone but still bleeding into space. "We study echoes," he said, "because they're all we have." Meanwhile, individuals began creating what they called personal observatories. Not telescopes, but rituals. Each morning, people would look at the sky and speak to it, not expecting response. Each evening, they would write letters to the stars, fold them, burn them, or bury them. "We are not trying to understand the stars anymore," one woman explained. "We are trying to maintain a relationship." It was grief, but not despair, more like tending the grave of an old friend, knowing they cannot answer, but feeling they still matter. On the moon, a small station continued to operate a short-range optical array designed to observe Earth. It was among the few instruments still used actively, because Earth, being close, still delivered light with manageable delay. But even here, the margin grew. Storms recorded from orbit would already be waning before the data returned. Earthquakes were visible in dust plumes that had already settled. It was like watching your own shadow trip and fall hours later. The crew at Moonbase Lysandra began a new practice. Each member wrote daily reports not for mission control, but for themselves. "I record the present as I feel it," one wrote, "because the present I see cannot be trusted." In one log, a technician wrote about watching a sunrise from orbit and realizing, horrifyingly, that the sun might already have flared. "By the time we see it," he wrote, "we may already be gone." But they weren't gone. The station endured. So did Earth. Life adapted, slowly, painfully, creatively. Back in the Andes, El Testigo eventually ran out of storage. No one came to replace the drives. The telescope continued to move, to observe, to remember. But its memory now vanished into itself. It became an act without consequence, a ritual without audience. And yet, high in the cold, dark, it remained, turning, watching, loving the stars for what they once were. The shift from observation to reverence did not happen all at once. In some places, it crept in like fog, unnoticed until everything had changed. In others, it struck like a sudden silence, as when a musician stops playing mid-note and the absence of sound becomes a sound in itself. One such silence settled over the South African Karoo array. Once home to hundreds of radio dishes scanning the heavens for signs of alien life, it now stood mute. Not because the project failed, but because its premise had collapsed. "What if we receive a signal?" asked one engineer, "and by the time we respond, the civilization is already gone?" It was not a hypothetical. Every signal was now a ghost. Every pattern in the noise was a past tense. The universe had become a graveyard of greetings. Still, they listened. Not because they expected answers, but because listening itself had become sacred. One of the last scientists working at the array, a woman named Dineo, began to host quiet, unscheduled broadcasts. She would speak into the void, not to aliens, not to other labs, but to the sky itself. "We remember you," she'd say. "You burned bright. You sent your voice. We hear you now." Her colleagues at first thought it a coping mechanism, but soon others joined. Not just scientists, but poets, children, the elderly. They submitted messages to Dineo's terminal, little fragments of hope, gratitude, questions without askers. "Did you have oceans? What did your clouds look like? We are sorry we came too late." The broadcast continued for years. No reply ever came, but they kept sending. On the other side of the world, in a forest outside Kyoto, a group of monks reinterpreted ancient Zen koans through the lens of delayed light. "If the moon smiles," one asked, "but its light takes a second to reach the lake, when does the lake feel joy?" They replaced their clocks with stones that change color when warmed by the sun. Not because they were accurate, but because they were here. Time, they said, must be local to be trusted. In Paris, an old cathedral converted part of its crypt into a chapel of arrival. There, old telescopic images of distant galaxies were projected onto stone walls, slowly shifting over hours. Visitors would enter, sit in silence and watch. No guide, no narration, just light, arriving, late, but still beautiful. A plaque at the entrance read, "Here we witness the persistence of beauty beyond relevance." Meanwhile, in the academic world, new disciplines emerged. Light archaeology became one of the most respected. Scholars trace starlight back not to its source, but to its context, cross-referencing it with historical events, simulations of interstellar trajectories, and gravitational lensing data. "We do not ask what this light is," said one professor. "We ask, what was it trying to be?" The question itself became sacred. In a university in Buenos Aires, students took a course titled "The Ethics of Looking." The syllabus warned, "To see is to harm if what is seen cannot respond." They debated whether it was moral to observe light from stars that may no longer exist, whether passive seeing was a form of colonialism, whether awareness without connection was exploitation. These weren't just intellectual exercises. They changed how people built. Windows were tinted, not for privacy, but for reverence. Buildings faced inward. Observatories became more like chapels. And telescopes, once aimed outward with ambition, now aimed inward with humility. Neeraj, writing one of his last public essays, captured it this way. The stars are no longer ours to know. They are ours to mourn. He didn't mean it in sadness. He meant it in awe. To mourn something is to admit it shaped you, even if it's gone, even if it never knew you were watching. Back in the Andes, El Testigo was finally buried, not by neglect, but by a snowstorm so vast and slow that no one could reach it for years. When drones eventually returned, the dome was intact but sealed. The last image it had captured was a wide view of the Carina Nebula, blooming in hues of blue and violet. A note, left by a technician before the storm, had been wedged under a panel. It read simply, "This was still beautiful." The note was never removed. It remains there under the ice, inside the silent witness. Because some things are not meant to be retrieved, only remembered. In a sealed laboratory beneath the surface of Central Australia, a team of engineers and artists were building a sky. Not the kind you look up to, but the kind that looks back. They called it Project Ether, an audacious attempt to simulate the night in real time, not by waiting for light, but by generating it. They weren't recreating the stars, they were inventing replacements. Using quantum predictive models, gravitational data, and historical recordings of stellar behavior, they constructed a full celestial dome that shimmered above their artificial valley. Thousands of embedded micro-emitters mimicked star fields. They blinked not based on observation, but on prediction. The idea wasn't to replicate the past, but to create a now that could be trusted. "We're not rebuilding the universe," said lead designer Omar Kadir. "We're giving it a prosthetic." The dome was not perfect. It lacked nuance. Some stars flared too regularly, others dimmed with suspicious rhythm. But for those who stood beneath it, the experience was profound. For the first time in years, one visitor said, "I felt seen by the sky again." It wasn't about truth. It was about presence, about being in dialogue with something that responded. Over time, versions of Project Ether began appearing around the world. In Dubai, one was installed above a desert amphitheater. In Iceland, a version danced above geothermal springs. Some were massive public installations. Others were personal, quiet, glowing in backyards or courtyards or hospice gardens. Each followed a similar algorithm. Predict the stars not as they are, but as they might wish to appear. Not everyone approved. Critics called it celestial theatre. They argued it was dishonest, a distraction from reality. "We should mourn the loss of immediacy," one scientist insisted, "not pretend it never left." But Omar disagreed. What if the stars want us to dream? What if their last wish was to be imagined rather than forgotten? The debate became philosophical, not about light, but about meaning. Is a sky less valid if it lies? Is an echo less beautiful if it doesn't come from what we thought? Meanwhile, children growing up under the synthetic heavens developed a new relationship with space. They knew it wasn't real. They loved it anyway. They gave names to stars that never existed. They drew constellations the real universe never provided. "This one is called the listener," a girl said, pointing to a cluster arranged in the shape of a bent ear, "because it always hears you when you're alone." The line was picked up by a poet in Marseille who wrote an entire collection titled Stars That Hear. It sold millions. People began leaving messages for the sky again. This time, not expecting answers, but echoes. Some installations added whisper chambers, acoustic zones where you could speak, and your words would ripple outward as tiny bursts of light across the dome. One man proposed marriage this way. His words turned into constellations. She said yes. Not all versions of ether were public. In one remote research outpost near the Chilean Atacama, a solitary astronomer named Lena built her own. It wasn't large, just a dome over a meditation room, programmed to emulate what the sky above might be doing in that exact moment, if light still arrived quickly. She called it the room that pretends. Every evening, she sat beneath it, eyes closed, letting the imagined stars blink above her. "I know it's false," she wrote in her log, "but so is memory. And yet, we live inside both." Others followed her example. A cultural movement emerged, constructed night. Architects began designing homes with artificial domes overhead, each tailored to a family's emotional landscape. Some skies were gentle, others chaotic. One therapist used them in trauma treatment. "Choose your sky," she told her patients. "Build a heaven you can trust." And in these new nightscapes, something unexpected began to happen. People started looking up again, not to measure, not to learn, but to feel, to wonder, to remember what it was like when stars felt close, even if they weren't, when light was a friend, not a delay, when the sky responded not with truth, but with care. Yana visited one such installation near Istanbul. She stood alone under the dome as it cycled through seasons of hypothetical light. "It's fiction," she whispered, "but it's present." In her journal, she later wrote, "Maybe all we ever wanted was not to be right about the stars, just to not be forgotten by them." The line was inscribed on a plaque at the entrance, not as a conclusion, but as an invitation, because in a world where light was late and truth became a kind of shadow, the most radical act was to imagine something kind and believe in it anyway. In a city beneath the Pacific Ocean, deep in one of the last functioning subaquatic arcologies, the inhabitants no longer tracked real time at all. Their sky, such as it was, glowed from above, an enormous screen of meticulously rendered stars updated by predictive AI. It wasn't just a dome of light. It was a narrative, a story of how the universe could behave if it still cared to be understood. The updates were not frequent. Every few weeks, the system would quietly change the positions of several constellations, based not on data, but on a consensus of emotional sentiment gathered from those living below. "We don't chart the sky," said one of the programmers. "We chart ourselves, and the sky listens." Schools in the arcology taught stellar mythology again, not the myths of ancient Earth, but new ones born from the simulated heavens. Children memorized stories of stars named after forgotten feelings: Sorrow Light, the Star of Forgiveness, Ember Pause. And the mythologies evolved. People wrote sequels. Entire generational sagas played out in constellations that never existed. One teacher said, "We may be the last to write the sky, and we are writing it with grief and hope in equal measure." Back on the surface, the artificial sky movement spread to digital spaces. VR platforms offered fully customizable celestial experiences. Users could build their own universes, complete with hand-designed galaxies, meteor showers, and eclipses. One popular setting was called The Sky Before Goodbye, a night dome filled with stars that dimmed only when looked at directly. It became a place for farewells, for endings, for the act of letting go. Others preferred the listening field, where stars would pulse gently in response to the user's heartbeat, creating a private, rhythmic bond between observer and fiction. Philosophers began debating whether a simulated sky, constructed from human meaning, was more real than a physical sky built from silent, distant light. "Which sky speaks to us more clearly?" asked an ethicist. "The one that arrives too late, or the one that was made just for now?" Jana continued her work, though her focus had shifted. She no longer analyzed photonic delay or data degradation. Instead, she studied emotional response, how synthetic starlight affected cortisol levels, memory recall, empathy. She discovered something strange. People exposed to consistent artificial star fields showed improved long-term mood stability, even when they knew the sky was false. "It's not about truth," she wrote. "It's about rhythm. Predictable light calms unpredictable minds." She published a paper titled "The Therapeutic Lie," which became wildly controversial. Critics accused her of promoting deception. Supporters claimed she had proven that narrative mattered more than physics. Neeraj, in one of his few remaining transmissions, offered a quiet observation. "We've replaced the observable universe with a believable one. And perhaps that is evolution, not regression." His message ended there. No follow-up ever came. Some believed he joined a deep-range mission. Others said he'd gone silent deliberately to become part of the myth. Either way, his voice became one more echo, one more ghost star in the human-made sky, and the skies kept changing. In some communities, they began to reflect seasonal moods, brighter in spring, muted in fall. In others, they responded to collective voting, with citizens casting ballots for how the stars should behave. A few radical groups even rejected fixed stars entirely, creating chaotic sky patterns that changed every hour, symbolizing the uncertainty of life. But even in those turbulent versions, a kind of order emerged. People began to find shapes in the chaos. They named them, told stories, drew meaning, because that's what people do. One installation in Finland became famous for its morning constellation, a slowly rotating field of dim blue points that shimmered with recorded voices of the dead. Visitors could upload a whisper, a name, a goodbye. The stars would absorb them, replaying them in soft choral fragments. "It's not the stars," one woman said. "It's the people we lost, finally given a place to live." In time, Earth became a planet of imagined skies. The real one still burned, still sent its messages, but no one trusted them. The truth took too long. The fiction was faster, closer, kinder. Jana stood one evening beneath a simulation in northern Norway. Above her, artificial auroras curled like memory. Stars blinked in algorithms designed for peace. She closed her eyes and listened. Somewhere in the synthetic firmament, a programmed meteor began to fall. It wasn't real, but it felt right. And maybe, in this strange new era of slowness and substitution, that was enough. Not because the stars no longer mattered, but because they had become something more sacred than fact. They had become the canvas upon which we painted our need to be seen, remembered, and believed. Not everyone accepted the new sky. While much of humanity turned inward into simulations, stories, and artificial stars, there were others who looked outward and saw a challenge instead of a loss. They called themselves runners, technologists, relativists, isolationists, people who believed that if light could not come to us fast enough, perhaps we could go to it. The idea wasn't new. Time dilation had been understood for centuries. But now, with the collapse of synchronized observation, it became more than theory. It became ambition. In the orbital city of Selene 3, a team of physicists launched the Astræus Initiative, an experimental long-range vessel designed not to reach a destination, but to race time itself. Its mission: travel fast enough that the starlight arriving at Earth would still be relevant by the time they caught up to it. "We're not chasing planets," said Mission Commander Ileana Reyes. "We're chasing the present." The ship was small, built for 4 crew, shielded against relativistic radiation, self-sustaining for 10 years. The plan: accelerate for 5, observe for 1, decelerate for 4. Return with first-hand knowledge of events only photons had witnessed. In a world where starlight had become unreliable, human eyes became a novelty. The launch was quiet, not secret, but solemn. Few believed they would succeed. Fewer believed it would matter. But the crew didn't care. They weren't after consensus. They were after communion. After the first year, transmission delays grew severe. After year 3, Astræus went dark, not because it failed, but because Earth could no longer receive its updates in anything resembling real time. By the time messages arrived, their content had already been replaced by faster fiction, and yet they kept sending. Their last confirmed transmission was a simple line: "We are still running." Back on Earth, a philosophical movement called temporalism began to grow. Its central premise was this: only direct experience is real. All else is memory or myth. Temporalists rejected simulations, discarded artificial skies, and dismantled delay-ridden networks. They returned to localism, not as politics, but as physics. "If I cannot see it now," said one manifesto, "I will not see it at all." Some called them Luddites. Others called them purists. They built towers instead of telescopes, not to look up, but to look around, to see sunsets with their own eyes, to track planets with handmade lenses, to watch the moon not as a symbol, but as an immediate truth. Temporalist communes appeared in deserts, forests, tundras. Their motto: nothing older than the moment. They became a kind of resistance, not against science, but against latency. And they weren't alone. On Mars, a research team began experimenting with hyper-adaptive drones, automated vessels capable of near-light flight, each programmed to orbit a specific star and broadcast real-time telemetry via quantum entanglement proxies. It wasn't scalable. It wasn't even fully proven. But it was real. "We've built messengers," said the lead Martian engineer. "They cannot think, but they can see. And they see now." The effort consumed massive resources. Critics called it wasteful, desperate, a vanity project. But those who funded it believed otherwise. "Truth has a cost," one backer said, "and delay is the tax on meaning." The drones were called mirrors, each assigned to a star, each carrying a payload of sensors, memory, and a single message etched into their hulls: "Tell us what you see." One by one, they launched. Most were never heard from again. A few succeeded. And from those few came the first real-time star data in decades. It was sparse, fragmented. But it was now. Earth-based scientists, long abandoned by their tools, wept when the first packet arrived. Not because of what it contained, a brief solar pulse, a radiation pattern, but because it was happening as they read it. Real time, present tense. For a moment, the past released its grip. Across the planet, those who still believed in empirical light celebrated. Simulations dimmed. Synthetic skies paused. And everyone, briefly, looked up. Not at the sky, but into the dark, into the possibility that truth could be rescued. The moment passed. The connection faltered, but something had shifted. not in the sky, in the heart. Humanity, it seemed, would never fully agree on what the stars meant. But in that instant, it didn't matter. Some ran, some watched, some dreamed, and all of them, in their own way, reached toward the same impossible thing. A sky that was not late, a universe that did not forget, a light that belonged not to memory, but to now. In the aftermath of Astraeus and the launch of the mirrors, Earth began to split not into factions of nations or ideologies, but of chronologies. You could now ask someone not only where they lived or what they believed, but when they existed. For some, the answer was simple: now. For others, it was always a little earlier, suspended in a latency of starlight and memory. Temporalists began to call themselves Nois, a title that originally began as a joke but took on deeper meaning. They lived without recorded history, deleted cached data after 24 hours, and outlawed media created more than a day earlier. In Noah's cities, clocks were banned, not because time didn't matter, but because measuring it created illusions. We live inside our experience, their core document read, not outside of it. Their critics accuse them of denialism, of willful ignorance. They mistake the absence of evidence for the presence of purity, said one ex-member. But just because you refuse the past doesn't mean the present is clean. Despite the tension, Noist communities thrived in their own way. They became havens for mindfulness, direct perception, bodily awareness. Painters painted in real time, never revisiting a canvas. Musicians improvised endlessly, recording nothing. Parents taught children how to feel the passage of sun through skin as their primary calendar. Yet even in these bastions of presentness, ghosts remained. Because light never stopped arriving, it still poured in from dying stars, from galaxies long vanished, from events so ancient they defied comprehension. Some Nois wore blindfolds at night. Others used mirrored domes to reflect the sky, reducing direct celestial exposure. But nothing truly erased the knowledge that the present was haunted. In orbit, a different faction emerged, the laterals. They didn't reject delay, they embraced it. They argued that reality was layered, not linear, and that experiencing the past was not failure, but a feature. Their habitats floated in slow, wide arcs around the Earth, tuned to receive and process deep space signals exclusively. Their homes were built with translucent walls covered in light-sensitive gel that shimmered as messages arrived. Living inside one was like inhabiting a constantly evolving aurora. One lateral artist, named Ciel, designed a structure called the House of 1,000 Yesterdays. Every room displayed a starlight image from a different era, some 100 years old, others 100 million. We do not live in delay, she said. We live in history made visible. Meanwhile, the scientific community tried to thread the needle between Nois and laterals, pushing forward a new framework known as relational time. Under this model, the value of information wasn't determined by how fast it arrived, but by who it arrived to and why. An event seen late could still be meaningful if it resonated with the observer's internal clock. Meaning, wrote theorist Aaron Lee, is not in the moment, it is in the meeting. This led to the creation of the first ChronoNet, a communication platform that indexed content not by timestamp, but by psychological proximity. Messages would arrive when your body was most ready to receive them. A poem written 20 years ago might only surface today, because today it might actually matter. Emotional context replaced objective time. This deeply unnerved governments and archivists, but resonated strongly with individuals. The ChronoNet spread. Culture began to fracture, not by generation or language, but by tempo. Slow livers and fast livers, reflexives and resonance. And amid all of it, the stars continued to shine, never present, never quite past, only there, somewhere, for the runners still in motion, like the Astraeus crew, now deep beyond Pluto's path. The question was no longer just about observation. It was about identity. Were they still part of humanity? Or had they become time travelers of another sort? Witnesses to a version of the universe no one else would ever see. Commander Ileana Reyes wrote in her last visible log, "If we die out here, we do so in the present. No one will remember us in real time, but we will remember the sky as it was, and maybe that's all history ever was, memory with no echo." Her message, like many before it, vanished into the long bandwidth of space, reaching Earth years later. By then, she was already myth. In one university, her name was given to a course, Real Time and the Tragedy of Speed. Students debated whether her mission was noble or narcissistic. They never reached consensus, but they all stared upward a little longer that night, because the light still came, slow, steady, silent, and with every photon a question. Do you still want to know me, even if I'm gone? For centuries, the question had been, what happens when light arrives too late? But then came something stranger, something that rewrote even the most stable assumptions. A transmission, clean, verifiable, electromagnetic, arrived at an observatory on the lunar far side. It contained no words, just a visual, a planetary system not yet discovered, a trinary star circled by 7 satellites and 1 large habitable moon. The data was pristine, too pristine. "This isn't a signal from the past," said lead astronomer Ko Tanaka. "This is a map from the future." The coordinates pointed to a region where, according to every known catalogue, there was only dust and background radiation, but the transmission described it in detail, right down to gravitational fluctuations and atmospheric composition. Some thought it a hoax, others an artifact of light speed fluctuations, like a wave skipping ahead of itself. The term precursive light was coined. It referred to signals that seemed to anticipate reality, not from wormholes or paradoxes, but as byproducts of a changing light constant, bursts of information untethered from chronology. And this wasn't the only case. Within months, similar anomalies appeared, fragments of events not yet observed, coordinates that would later reveal stars still in the process of formation. Telescopes aimed toward these sites began to witness, slowly, faintly, the predicted births. In essence, the sky was telling us what it would become, not definitively, but suggestively. "We are seeing the future," said Ko. "Not all of it, just echoes of what might settle into being." The implications were staggering. For the first time in history, humanity wasn't just looking back, it was looking ahead. Institutions fractured. Some viewed this as proof of destiny, that the universe had a fixed trajectory. Others saw it as statistical noise, random data that merely appeared prophetic. But the signals kept coming, clearer, more specific. A solar flare that would happen 3 days later. A comet impact 5 years out. A new exoplanet, complete with surface temperature data and magnetic field estimates. Verified only a decade later, but precisely matched. "It's like the universe is trying to warn us," wrote one astrophysicist, "or prepare us, or test whether we believe it." Theologians seized on the idea. Were these divine messages? Had the cosmos become a scripture of sorts, one we could read, not for meaning, but for foresight? A sect emerged calling themselves the Readers of the Not Yet. They built temples aligned to predicted constellations, observed not what was, but what should be, based on precursive light. They waited for stars that hadn't appeared. They named constellations not yet visible. Faith is knowing the shape of light before it casts shadow, their doctrine said. Meanwhile, scientists tried to verify the mechanisms. Could faster-than-light particles, previously only theoretical, be creating illusions of forward data? Was the speed of light fluctuating in localized bursts? A physicist named Danica Rousseau developed a theory called temporal refraction, the bending of time through light rather than space. What we see early may not be the future, she said, but the light of a present that simply reached us before its context. The theory gained traction. Observatories began cataloguing a separate sky, the projected celestial map, distinct from the observable one. It became a parallel universe, not imaginary, but premature. Students studied it as speculative astrophysics. Artists painted it as prophecy. Composers wrote music based on stellar arrangements not yet visible. In Berlin, a gallery opened titled "Before the Sky Knows Itself." Each room displayed renderings of possible stars, annotated with expected arrival dates. It became a place for birthdays. People would walk through and say, "That star will appear when I turn 70. In time, the concept of present sky lost its meaning. News channels reported meteorological forecasts and stellar forecasts alike. Clear skies tonight, with 3 new arrivals from Sector 83 Delta. The Proxima flare forecast is still uncertain, so keep your solar shades ready. And amid all this wonder, a quiet fear grew. What if some light told of disasters? Could we act on knowledge not yet contextualized? If we see a supernova before it happens, can we trust it? Or worse, can we change it? A debate raged. Does observation confirm destiny or offer the opportunity to divert it? A growing number believed in the latter. They called themselves the interveners. They viewed precursive light as a warning system, early alerts from a chaotic cosmos. In labs across Earth and Mars, they simulated events described by the anomalous light, trying to alter the circumstances before they matured. It wasn't always clear what action to take. The light didn't come with instructions, just data. But the attempt itself became sacred. "We do not wait for calamity," their motto read. "We meet it before it learns its name." The first success, if it was one, came when a predicted asteroid collision failed to occur. Was it error, coincidence, or a result of quiet intervention? No one could say. But the belief spread. The future, if glimpsed, could be changed. And the stars, once silent, once slow, were no longer just witnesses. They had to become participants in our unfolding story, not just by what they showed, but by when they chose to show it. As the phenomenon of precursive light became more widespread and consistent, society shifted in ways no one had predicted. Calendars began to include not just dates for events already scheduled, but pre-light indications, shadows of things yet to come. Governments began to receive alerts from deep space observatories, not only about what had happened in distant galaxies, but about what was statistically likely to manifest locally based on light signatures that shouldn't exist yet. One of the first publicized cases was a landslide in the Andes. 3 weeks prior, a minor station in Patagonia picked up an anomalous signature, a reflected pulse in the upper atmosphere consistent with geological displacement. No seismic data confirmed it. No tremors were felt. But on the date the signal suggested, the mountain moved. A scientist named Eva Merceau published a controversial paper titled "Causality Backwards: When the Universe Predicts Itself." In it, she proposed a model. where space-time reconfigured itself continuously based on feedback from its own propagation. If light moves ahead of itself, she wrote, then causality is no longer upstream to downstream. It's recursive. It loops. It watches itself unfold. Religious groups latched onto this concept. They argued that morality itself might be based not on what we do, but on what light expects us to do. You are the echo of a decision you have not made, one preacher said during a viral sermon. But the stars already know what's inside you. This idea was terrifying to many. Were we still free? Did agency survive when the cosmos began to anticipate our choices? Universities began offering courses in precognitive ethics, where students debated whether to act on warnings of events they could not verify. Case studies included predicted murders that never happened, disasters that reversed course, and anomalies where pre-light contradicted real-time observation. Was it lying, glitching, or simply unfolding differently? One case shook the global psyche. An intercepted signal from a relay satellite orbiting Europa contained a distress call dated 4 years in the future. It was signed by a crew that hadn't launched yet. The call included coordinates, biosigns, and logs of a failed excavation, detailing a methane pocket rupture and loss of habitat pressure. The logs were chillingly specific, but the mission hadn't happened. The team didn't exist. And yet, based on the warning, plans were changed. Mission parameters adjusted. The danger avoided. The signal was archived, but never publicly decoded. They saved themselves, someone whispered, before they even existed. Meanwhile, artists responded in the only way they knew how, by embracing the ambiguity. A composer named Sira Andalon wrote a piece called Notes from a Light That Shouldn't Be Here, composed entirely using stellar spectral data from projected stars. The performance lasted 29 minutes and ended with the musicians leaving the stage in silence, as the hall lights dimmed exactly 13 seconds before the final note had been scheduled to play. The audience, breath held, didn't know whether to clap or weep. Elsewhere, a poet on Titan began releasing daily verses written not by hand or algorithm, but translated from early light readings she believed carried subconscious human intent. "The sky is dreaming of us," she said. "I'm just writing its dreams." Some thought her delusional. Others called her the first oracle of the new chronology. A new kind of science emerged, anticipatory cosmology. Its practitioners didn't wait for confirmation. They hypothesized based on what the universe might be becoming. They were criticized heavily by empiricists, but their predictions in some cases proved unsettlingly accurate. "We are not forecasting the weather," said one proponent. "We are forecasting the stars." Over time, the world grew quieter, not because it stopped moving, but because people began listening harder, to the sky, to the small signs, to the data that shouldn't yet exist. Some claimed the stars whispered, that in the hum of background radiation, you could hear possibility taking shape. In a monastery built on a floating barge near the magnetic South Pole, monks practiced silent observation. 8 hours a day spent beneath a slowly shifting canopy of precursive light, meditating on the contradiction of knowing before believing. They did not speak, they only watched, and sometimes they cried, not from fear, but from awe, because they had seen the future blink, and it had blinked back. The final twist came quietly. A deep space probe, returning from a 10-year mission, arrived with data that should have taken centuries to reach Earth. Its internal clock was correct, its systems unaltered, and yet its memory banks contained records of celestial bodies that had not yet formed, and others that, according to current models, should never exist. One object in particular, a black hole where no mass had yet collapsed, appeared in its logs. Days later, the collapse began. The black hole formed, just as described, at the exact coordinates. No one could explain how the probe had seen it before it happened, or whether, in observing the signal, we had caused it. The paradox spiraled. Philosophers fell silent. Scientists debated off record, and the rest of the world adapted. They looked up and wondered not what the sky had to tell them about the past, but what it was trying to say about who they might become. When the stars began showing us things they shouldn't yet know, it wasn't long before someone tried to collect them. The effort began quietly, in the sub-levels of the Martian Library complex beneath Olympus Mons, an underground vault originally designed to protect data from radiation storms. There, in humidity-controlled vaults and magnetically sealed chambers, humanity's most fragile ideas were stored. The first quantum recordings, deep scans of pre-collapse Earth cultures, and fragments of memory salvaged from long-defunct consciousness backups. Now, something new was added, the Archive of Yet. Its purpose was deceptively simple, to catalogue what had not yet happened, but the task proved anything but. Archivists quickly discovered they weren't just receiving predictions, they were receiving timelines, each slightly different, sometimes conflicting, always incomplete. Some entries overlapped, others contradicted. A star predicted to form in one set of data was predicted to explode in another. One sequence showed the collapse of Europa's ice shelf in 2133. Another showed its gradual reinforcement by artificial lattice until 2150. Faced with these discrepancies, the archivists created a new classification system, certainty spectra. Each entry was labeled along 3 axes: temporal proximity, how soon the event might occur; light confidence, how strong the signal was; and divergence pressure, how likely the event was to change once observed. This final measure proved the most difficult. The more people looked at a precursive signal, the more likely it was to shift. Not disappear, just migrate, like a shoreline under the tide. Some called it observation fracture. Others preferred the term causal drift. But whatever name was used, the result was the same. Human attention had become part of astrophysical evolution. Watching wasn't neutral. It was an act of shaping. In response, the archive created a new ethical protocol called the Blindfold Directive. Certain events, once detected, were deliberately not analyzed. Their data was stored, sealed, and set to auto-unlock at specific dates, when the event, if real, would have already occurred or failed to. We must not force the future to pick a form too soon, read the internal directive. Let it arrive as it was meant to, not as we nudged it into being. The first sealed file was titled Observer Null Event 739 Beta. Its contents were never released, but months later, a gravitational anomaly detected near Saturn, previously unheard of, occurred precisely on the date encoded in the locked file's checksum. Whether the archive had foreseen it, caused it, or merely guessed, no one knew. But trust in the system grew. New institutions emerged around the archive. The temporal cartographers, who plotted likely futures on rotating hologlobes. The historians of tomorrow, who wrote narratives based on signals not yet verified. And the grey editors, who managed the ethics of early data leaks. We live now, one grey editor said, in a world where truth is a timeline, and fact is a matter of restraint. Cultural changes followed. Birthdays began including not only a person's age, but their observed divergence count, how many times their anticipated path had been revised based on starlight. Some wore these counts as symbols of uniqueness, others hid them. Children born after the archive's founding were known as the generation of yet. They grew up with the understanding that nothing was truly fixed, not even the past. "What did I do yesterday?" one child asked her teacher. "That depends," the teacher replied, "on how far the light had traveled when you looked." Education systems adapted. History classes taught not only what had happened, but also what had been expected to happen. Students studied divergent timelines like alternate languages, learning the grammar of uncertainty. Literature evolved too. Authors began embedding precursive passages into their work, sections that readers wouldn't unlock until a future date, based on their personal divergence metrics. These time-locked novels became immensely popular. One book, The Wind That Hasn't Come Yet, was read in fragments that arrived via light-based puzzles, with each chapter visible only when a specific astronomical condition aligned with the reader's birth data. Critics called it pretentious. Fans called it spiritual. Meanwhile, the archive continued to expand. Outposts were built in Lagrange points, on asteroid surfaces, in the cloud cities of Venus. Each one synced to the master archive through quantum entanglement, though even that suffered minor delays now, lightspeed itself no longer being entirely reliable. The archivists, now considered a philosophical order as much as scientific curators, began holding vigils during stellar transitions. When a predicted nova failed to arrive, they held quiet ceremonies, not as mourners, but as witnesses to a future that had chosen a different shape. "We honor the unmade," said the inscription at the gate of Archive Node 17. That which did not happen is still part of what we are. In a chamber deep beneath the main vault, an experimental device called the timeline mirror was being constructed. Its purpose, not just to observe early arriving light, but to project it, allowing a person to stand before their own potential futures as refracted in starlight. Critics feared it would become addictive, like a drug made of possible selves. Proponents argued it was the most honest mirror ever built. Trials began quietly. The results were inconclusive, but emotionally profound. One participant stepped away and said only, "I saw who I could have been, and for once, I didn't grieve." The mirror was sealed for now, but whispers suggested it still glowed faintly, reflecting stars not yet formed, and people not yet broken. As the archive of Yet matured, it began to take on responsibilities once reserved for global timekeeping authorities, astronomical unions, and even intelligence agencies. But this wasn't just a repository anymore. It was becoming a compass for causality itself. When a new anomaly was discovered in the Messier quadrant, its signal arrived fragmented, barely legible against the cosmic noise. But it was fast, far too fast. So fast that it contradicted every principle of relativistic communication. The message was triangulated to an object that, by all current models, wouldn't exist for another 35 years. It was catalogued as Event Horizon Echo 6 Lambda, and even though nothing yet occupied those coordinates, the archive flagged the entry as high confidence. Within months, the region of space began exhibiting dust accumulation, then gravitational distortions, then silence. When questioned, one archivist responded, "It's not a prediction, it's a receipt." This wasn't unique. Every week, more events arrived early. Not from the future, perhaps, but from the shape the future was leaning toward. Human civilizations had always lived by calendars, clocks, ephemerides. Now they consulted velocity curvature tables and precursive light maps, tools designed to tell them not just where things would be, but what version of the future seemed most probable, most persistent. Navigation itself began to change. Starships no longer plotted courses based solely on gravitation or fuel efficiency. They plotted light trajectories, charting paths that harmonized with the timing of early emissions, hoping to avoid disturbances in the causal mesh. One class of pilot began using what was called aural drift, a practice of steering based on the background harmonics of precursive interference. They described it as flying through a song with no beginning, finding the rhythm that hadn't yet arrived. One pilot explained it this way: you don't fly toward stars anymore, you fly toward their intent. Of course, such methods invited risk. One mission, famously documented in the file Io Singularity incident, veered entirely off expected trajectory when the crew began following a ghost signal, something they believed was an early echo of their own future position. They vanished, not destroyed, just out of sync. Later, an unrelated observer picked up what sounded like fragments of a log entry from that ship, time-stamped a full century into the future. The file was stored, not broadcast, not examined, not yet. A rule was established. Future signals require future context. The world began living by a new code, not just informational but spiritual. "We do not rush what the stars delay," said a plaque above the control panel of the interstellar ship Calypso 9. Meanwhile, the archive began noticing another pattern. Some precursive signals seemed less like records of events and more like responses, as though the cosmos wasn't just showing the future, it was adjusting to our attention. A controversial theory arose called reciprocal light consciousness. It proposed that precursive data wasn't merely arriving ahead of time. It was interacting, forming an emergent awareness based on the sum total of observed signals. The more humanity studied the future, the more that future adapted. "We are in conversation," wrote Danica Rousseau, now head of the Temporal Ethics Division. "Not with a god, not with a force, but with something that is just now learning how to speak." The implications were staggering. Philosophers began to argue over whether the universe, through its light, was developing intention. Could this explain why some predictions failed? Why some events never occurred? Were we watching a feedback loop mature into a dialogue? Theologians and AI theorists joined forces in an unlikely coalition to map out cognitive intervals, sections of time where precursive light behaved erratically, almost like hesitation. "What if," asked a widely read treatise, "these gaps are not errors, but the cosmos thinking?" Reactions varied. Some called it poetic nonsense. Others wept in silence. A movement arose, informally known as the Waiters. Their doctrine was simple: never act immediately on any precursive knowledge. Always allow space for light to clarify, for the universe to recalibrate, for human beings to choose. Their central text, the Patience Codex, was written entirely in delay mark script. Each page revealed itself only after the reader had spent a full hour in stillness. Critics said it was absurd. Followers called it the only sacred book you couldn't rush. Across the archive, new architecture was introduced. Reading rooms with no clocks. Observation halls that adjusted their lighting based on the surrounding starlight's divergence index. Walls embedded with prediction glyphs that only displayed when you stopped looking directly at them. The idea was no longer just to store the future, but to live with it gently, to let it settle. In the heart of the archive, a new chamber opened, the quiet vault. No signals went in, no signals came out. It held only the most volatile predictions, ones that had already shifted too many times, ones that risked collapsing under the weight of attention. Archivists entered blindfolded. They carried no devices. They memorized and then forgot, not out of neglect, but necessity. Some futures, said the lead vault-keeper, are safer unsaid. And in that silence, the archive of Yet continued its work, not to control time, or even to understand it, but to bear witness, to honor the arrivals, and to remember the light, even when it came too soon. There came a time when light no longer just carried information, it carried doubt. Somewhere between a signal and its verification, a strange phenomenon began to appear. Observations that didn't correspond to anything real, not in the present, not even in the anticipated future. These were not illusions. They were consistent, measured, and often shared between distant observatories. But they didn't belong. They were called temporal mirages, and their presence changed everything. The first recognized mirage was a nebula, spiral-shaped, soft-hued, drifting just above the galactic plane. It was detected simultaneously by 3 independent stations, each thousands of light years apart. Spectral analysis matched across all platforms, but the object didn't exist. Probes dispatched to the coordinates found only interstellar dust. No rotation, no shape, no light. And yet, every 34 hours, the ghost of that nebula would reappear in the archive's early light feed, identical in structure, fading gently, as if remembering itself. Researchers debated causes. Some blamed gravitational lensing errors. Others hypothesized a light fold, an echo trapped in warped space-time. But more radical thinkers proposed something else. Rejected futures. What we're seeing, said Dr. Vin Arash from the Institute for Divergent Physics, are fragments of timelines that almost happened. The universe started to become something else, and then changed its mind. This idea was dangerous. If true, it meant the cosmos didn't just evolve. It edited, but it also hinted at something more profound, that history was not a fixed trail, but a conversation, and mirages were its crossed-out lines. The theory gained traction when more mirages were detected. A planet that flickered in and out of infrared scans, complete with atmospheric signatures and pulse-like magnetic fields, yet never appeared visually. A transmission from a non-existent beacon, broadcasting rhythmic tones in a language no one could translate, tagged only with a timestamp from 78 years in the future. A human face, clear, expressionless, seen for 3 seconds on a wide-field telescope used to map stellar radiation. The image matched no known individual. It was archived under the code name Spectre 9. Analysis revealed no signs of forgery. The pixels were real. The face was not. Public anxiety surged. Were these anomalies signs, glitches, or something trying to communicate from a version of reality that didn't hold? One theory, quietly passed among archivists and precursive analysts, was called the mirror drop hypothesis. It suggested that some events were too unstable to persist, but stable enough to cast a reflection, like light bouncing off a surface that no longer existed. These reflections, they said, were not errors. They were apologies. The universe, wrote one anonymous archivist, remembers what it tried to become. Culturally, the impact was immense. Artists and poets began mining the archive's mirage files for inspiration. One exhibit, titled The Never-Born Sky, featured rotating holograms of planets that had once been, rendered from light signatures alone. The display was set to music composed entirely from undetectable frequencies, a song for things that never arrived. But not everyone found solace in the beauty. Some governments, concerned about societal destabilization, ordered the suppression of mirage data. In certain zones, all archive feeds were filtered. Anything flagged as high divergence was cut from public access. This led to the rise of black light networks, illegal groups who shared unfiltered light data across encrypted space relays. Their motto: "We believe in ghosts." One such group, the Horizon Cult, claimed to have located a mirage so persistent, so clear, it could be lived in. They referred to it as the Still City, a construct that appeared nightly in long-wave feeds from a forgotten quadrant. Its layout was always the same: 11 towers, 4 concentric streets, and a circular garden with a central monument shaped like a clock with no hands. According to the cult, the city did not change. It waited. Members of the group began disappearing, claiming they were going to join the city. Whether this was metaphor, madness, or migration, no one knew, but their feeds went silent. Some said the archive tried to locate the source. Others believed the archive already knew. Elsewhere, the concept of mirages took root in psychology. Therapists began using the term light residue to describe emotional patterns that had no present cause, feelings of joy, sorrow, dread that arrived with no trigger. "You may be feeling something," said one clinical guide, "that belongs to a future you almost lived." Meditation techniques emerged to cleanse the mirage. Rituals involving stillness, mirrored surfaces, and projected starfields designed to release one's attachment to futures that would never arrive. But not all responses were quiet. Some individuals grew obsessed with specific mirages. A mathematician on Ceres compiled over 900 frames of a single non-existent star, tracing its subtle variations and arguing it contained an encoded message. His final report ended with the phrase, "We're not supposed to be here yet." He vanished 2 days later. His quarters were untouched, but his archive login was used one more time to download a single file labeled "You Remember Too Soon." It was never recovered. The line between prediction and illusion began to blur. Even experienced analysts struggled to tell which events were anticipatory and which were echoes of unchosen paths. A new metric was added to archive entries: Mirage Index. Any reading above 0.7 triggered automatic quarantine protocols, but some users bypassed them. They wanted the mirages. They saw in them not danger, but possibility. "These aren't false," wrote a user known only as Mira 6. "They are futures we abandoned. That doesn't make them meaningless. That makes them sacred." In time, the archive issued a statement, not to the public, but to its staff. It was short. It read, "Light tells the truth, but not always ours." And with that, the world moved on, holding within it a growing constellation of moments that never came, a sky full of futures that had no place to go, except here. There was a new word in the archive's lexicon now: refractions. Unlike mirages, which were treated as isolated anomalies, refractions were more intimate, more personal. They weren't just future light bending oddly through unstable space-time. They were memories that didn't belong to you, sensations of presence in places you'd never been, or déjà vu that lingered for hours like smoke, and they were becoming common. A young technician stationed on Lagrange Relay to 12 reported waking up with vivid memories of a ship that didn't exist. He could describe its controls, its emergency protocols, even the names of crewmates, none of which had ever served. When asked to draw the interior, he did so with uncanny accuracy, matching a vessel from the archive's Mirage category D7. A craft designed but never built. "I think I remember dying on it," he whispered. His supervisors quietly reassigned him, Another case emerged on Earth. A linguist who began speaking a language no one recognized, but which contained grammar patterns identical to a dialect predicted to emerge on Europa in 3 centuries. She claimed she had always spoken this way and refused translation, insisting others would catch up. When asked how she learned it, she simply said, "The stars told me." Incidents like this began accumulating, not widespread, not epidemic, but persistent, enough to worry the custodians of the archive. A confidential report outlined a hypothesis. When light arrives early, identity arrives confused. The authors called it temporal saturation syndrome, and it proposed that the human mind, designed to tether memory to linear time, could be overwhelmed by precursive signal bleed. "We're not built for omnipresence," one researcher wrote. "We evolved to trust delay, to interpret after arrival. Now that the future is bleeding into the present, so are its scars." Those most affected were often deeply attuned to the archive's data streams. Analysts, starship navigators, theoretical cartographers. Some of them began wearing shielding visors, not for radiation, but to dampen the visual intake of precursive patterns. One such analyst developed a form of induced visual latency. Lenses that intentionally blurred signals for exactly 8.3 minutes, the time it takes for light from the sun to reach Earth. "I don't need to see everything now," she explained. "I want to feel how things used to arrive." Her device became popular among certain circles and was nicknamed the patient eye. Meanwhile, the line between personal memory and universal signal grew thin. People began recording time slips, personal experiences where events occurred out of order. A father remembers his child's voice changing before puberty. A woman reports scars on her hand from an accident that hasn't yet happened. In one recorded case, an astronaut on a solo survey mission filed a report about a planetary anomaly, a fault line that glowed faintly at night and seemed to pulse like breath. Months later, the same astronaut filed an identical report, down to the sentence, time-stamped before the mission was even launched. The event was flagged, then archived, then left alone. What was there to do? One counter-movement emerged, calling itself the slower now. Its followers rejected all forms of real-time data. They lived according to fixed, delayed updates, reading news from 2 weeks ago, watching stars only through filtered, aged feeds. They believed it restored clarity. "Time isn't broken," said one of their pamphlets. "Our speed is." They were peaceful, but growing. Others went the opposite direction. They sought total immersion. These were the light-touched, individuals who synced their neural feedback loops directly to precursive data feeds, accepting whatever impressions came through. For them, time was a spectrum, and all versions were welcome. One light-touched woman claimed to remember 7 separate lives, none of which matched existing records. "I'm not fragmented," she said. "I'm layered." Some scientists worried about these developments, not because they were dangerous, but because they were contagious. A whisper spread in theoretical circles. Precursive contamination isn't informational, it's narrative. That is, once you know a version of reality exists, your mind begins building it, weaving it into your life whether it belongs or not. It doesn't just inform, it inhabits. The archive created a new protocol, narrative shielding. Training programs were developed to help individuals compartmentalize conflicting timelines, recognize invasive memory loops, and maintain coherent selfhood. One such exercise was known as the unthreading. Participants would sit in a low-light chamber and describe memories aloud. while a secondary AI voice read counter-memories drawn from divergent signal logs into their left ear. The goal wasn't to decide which version was real, it was to remain whole despite the contradiction. Few passed, but those who did described an unsettling clarity afterward. "It's like standing in a house where every room is from a different century," one said. "But I know which one I sleep in." Still, for all these efforts, the archive could not stop the advance of refractions. More were coming. Every week, signals arrived from timelines that had no precedent, just spontaneous structures of logic and physics that did not match any cosmological history. In one case, light signatures encoded a form of gravity that pushed mass outward from planets, instead of pulling it inward. It was mathematically coherent, just not ours. These observations were not dismissed. They were stored in a vault labeled Adjacent Realities, under observation. But many believed they weren't adjacent. They were already here. We were just catching up. And so, society adapted again. Children learned to speak of their dreams in terms of possible nights. Artists created installations that changed shape depending on which direction you walked toward them. Maps now displayed not just locations, but the time likelihood of reaching them intact. And through it all, the mirages continued. No longer feared, no longer mourned, simply accepted, as lights that had touched the edge of becoming and lingered just long enough to be seen. In the end, the question wasn't about light at all. It wasn't about speed or transmission delay or the collapse of cause and effect. It was about presence. The real crisis began not with new data, but with silence. One day, the archive stopped receiving updates from the Orion Spindle Array. No warning, no error code, just absence. The last transmission was nothing unusual. A standard time-indexed telemetry log, listing background radiation, known planetary drift, and a single note in the margin. Starlight seems tired. Technicians flagged the note for poetic ambiguity and moved on. But when they checked again, the array had vanished, not physically, but observationally. Telescopes across the system could no longer locate it. Its signal did not reappear in precursive feeds, nor in legacy records. The Orion Array had been observed into non-existence. A new term emerged, oblivion drift. The concept that, under certain conditions, objects could fall so far out of light's consistency field that they would no longer appear in any frame of reference. Not because they were destroyed, but because their light had never finished arriving. Not delayed, not lost, just unfinished. "We don't lose things," said one analyst. "We forget to wait for them." This realization triggered a quiet panic in the archive. What else had been misread? How much of reality was weaved from approximations, from delayed reflections that we mistook for certainty? A reassessment protocol was initiated. Dozens of celestial bodies were reclassified, not based on observation but on confidence thresholds. Some planets were moved from known to assumed. Some stars were recategorized as persistent approximations. One galaxy, long thought stable, was declared hypothetically visible. The skies, once mapped with precision, had become probability clouds. And with this came a more intimate dread. If the light from other stars could be wrong, so could the light that formed you. Philosophers began asking a new kind of question. Not, who are we, but when are we real? In a lecture later banned from distribution, Professor Elon Meyer proposed that the human experience was not grounded in continuous presence, but in recursive illusions. "You think you exist now," he said, "because your light arrived on time. But ask yourself, what happens when it doesn't?" Across Earth and its colonies, the effects were subtle but spreading. People began reporting what they called delays of self. You would reach for a glass of water, and your hand would arrive a second too late. You'd say something in conversation, only to hear the words echo in your mind before your lips moved. These were not neurological disorders. Brain scans showed no anomalies, but the sense of misalignment persisted. Some described it as living in after-images. Others found comfort in it. "It means," wrote one user, "that I'm still catching up to myself." The archive developed protocols to test temporal presence, measuring reaction coherence between neural impulse and muscular response under extreme light distortion fields. The results were inconclusive. People remained functional, but something was off, not broken, just offset. A term was coined, chronoskew, the idea that consciousness had slipped half a beat out of sync with the world it thought it occupied. One test involved placing volunteers in a sealed, light-neutral chamber. No visual input, only auditory echoes derived from real-time atmospheric data. Participants emerged disoriented. Many asked if they had aged. One simply said, "I don't know if I was just here or I'm about to arrive." Outside the lab, everyday life adapted. Interfaces delayed their own feedback to help users maintain temporal anchoring. Music was re-engineered to accommodate micro-lag intervals, easing the cognitive dissonance between action and perception. Clocks, once designed for precision, now displayed ranges. You were not in one exact moment. You were within a time field. Even language changed. People no longer asked, "What time is it?" They asked, "What window are we in?" Time zones were deprecated. In their place came the light corridors, narrow bands of correlated signal strength that defined not where you lived, but how real you were likely to be. The most stable corridor, ironically, was found in the void between Earth and Mars, an empty drift point where signals crossed perfectly out of phase, producing what technicians called a calm delay. Pilgrims began visiting the region, some staying for days, others for months, seeking the comfort of desynchronization. One journal entry recovered from a traveler read, "Out here, I can finally think without thinking. I am not now, and it's a relief." The archive's leadership met in private to decide whether to intervene. One suggested anchoring society back to the past, fixing a reference frame, and refusing to acknowledge precursive data beyond a certain threshold. "Just because we can see early," he said, "doesn't mean we should." Another argued for full immersion, leaning into the shift, rewriting biology and consciousness to accommodate non-linear light experience. "If we're not now," she said, "then maybe we're something better." No consensus was reached, but a quiet decision was made. The archive would no longer label updates as new. They would simply be incoming. People could decide for themselves what that meant. In the silence that followed, a final observation was made. A small satellite, long thought lost, reappeared in the low light band, moving gently through an unmapped region of space. Its signal was faint, but rhythmic. Not a message, not a distress call, just a beacon repeating the same phrase in all languages once known to Earth. "We are still arriving." And so we arrived. Or perhaps we didn't. Perhaps what you're reading now is already behind you, light curling backward into a mind that has since moved on. That was the strange thing about endings in a world where the speed of light no longer held. Nothing truly stopped. It simply drifted. The archive, now centuries into its shift from a scientific observatory to something more akin to a philosophical lighthouse, issued its final directive. It was not a warning, not a conclusion, just a single line, broadcast without timestamp, to every receiver still listening. Everything you see is true, even the things that never happened. For many, this was liberating. If truth no longer relied on sequence, then meaning became a matter of resonance. People no longer measured the importance of an event by its place in time, but by how deeply it echoed in their lives. A memory of a conversation never held could still offer comfort. A glimpse of a skyline from a city never built could still stir awe. Humanity began to write in a new tense. Not past, not present, not future, but felt. I felt the sky, one poet wrote, and it remembered me before I was born. Religion evolved too, not into dogma, but into metaphor. The divine was no longer seen as omnipresent, but omni-temporal. Worship became silent observation. Cathedrals were constructed not from stone, but from harmonized signal fields, places where you could sit still and feel every possible version of yourself at once. These were not comforting places, but they were honest. Governments, for their part, gave up trying to enforce temporal order. Calendars dissolved. Bureaucracies simplified. You filed what you felt. You voted when you remembered. The notion of schedule vanished. There was only motion and recognition. Even the concept of home changed. Colonies scattered across distant moons and drifting stations no longer identified themselves by coordinates, but by signal signature. You'll find us, they would say, by the light that sounds like this. Children born into this world understood it differently. They were not confused by overlapping memories or timelines. To them, reality was a weave, not a line. One child, interviewed in a documentary titled The Last Constant, was asked when she felt most real. She answered, "When the stars are behind me." Asked why, she said, "Because that's when they see me first." Scientists tried to restore the old constants. They built machines to force delay back into the system, to slow photons through artificial lattices, to rebuild time as a predictable path. But the results were always temporary. The universe had already moved on. It no longer obeyed. It remembered. And what it remembered was not our models, but our questions. The stars did not fade. They became quieter, more distant, less insistent. The sky, once full of sharp edges and precise positions, became soft, abstract, almost watercolor. Not blurred, reconsidered. And yet, in all this change, one thing endured: the desire to witness, to look up, or inward, or backward, and ask, "What is this?" That question, stripped of time, became sacred, not because of the answers, but because of the asking. You, reading this, are part of that lineage. You are not here by accident. You're part of a signal still in motion. Perhaps this message arrived too early, or too late. Perhaps you were never meant to find it, and yet you did. That makes it real, for now. Somewhere beyond the last observatory, past the systems where light still pretends to obey, there is a field, empty, unnamed. Nothing has ever happened there. No birth, no collapse, no mirage. And yet, its signal is strong, steady, clean. As if the universe, tired of metaphor, gave us one last simple truth. It's catalogued in the archive under reference 0. Its entry is blank. Its only note reads, "Still here." Maybe that's enough. Not understanding, not resolution, but presence, delayed, distorted, displaced, but undeniable. Light will change, time will bend, but we, who ask the question, will always be part of the answer.